Great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robin Chazdon, who is a Senior Fellow of the Global Restoration Initiative at the World Resources Institute. She's Emeritus Professor at the University of Connecticut and part-time research professor at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. Work throughout her career has focused on the successional pathways, forest regeneration, and ecosystem services provided by forests and landscape restoration. And she, after 28 years as a university professor, she moved into the science policy and science practice arenas. I know Robin particularly well from her time from 2014 to 2019 as executive director of the Association of Tropical Biology and Conservation, where she did an outstanding effort in terms of creating this international community of tropical ecologists. And she's also director of the NSF-funded Research Coordination Network Partners, which is people and reforestation in the tropics. And she's authored many papers, and in 2014, she published a book, Second Growth, The Promise of Tropical Forest Regeneration in the Age of Deforestation. So with that, I'll hand over to Robin. Welcome to this seminar. Thank you for talking to us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Yadvinder, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this seminar event. I wish I could be there in person. Excellent. So hopefully you can all see this view here of a tree nursery in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. Today, I'm going to be talking about some of the recent efforts from my work and others to start to address some of the gaps that we have, not only in the science of restoration, but also in the policy and the practice. And it's very important to note that we have seen a huge number of advances over the last 50 years. And many of these have been improving human welfare around the world. And this nice article by Charles Mann that was published in National Geographic magazine illustrated many of the strides that have been made to improve the lives of people around the world. And that's a real backdrop, I think, for understanding the need for restoration, because these advances have tended to come at the expense of nature and many other conditions on our planet. And this is part of the article that Mann says these gains have been accompanied by losses. The list of environmental problems is different than it was in 1970, but it is also a bit more formidable. We have biodiversity loss, aquifer drainage, ocean acidification, soil degradation, and of course, the biggest challenge of all, climate change. And who can look at this list without quailing? And when I read that, I thought, oh, that's a very nice statement, but what is quailing? So I had to look up the word because I had not encountered this word before, but now I'm going to be using it very often, particularly now, particularly the week before our election happens in this country. We are all feeling this verb very, very deeply. And it is true, we have documented in just this year in the World Wildlife Living Planet report, declines in biodiversity across all the regions of the world. The declines are of a different magnitude, but from 1970 to 2016, these numbers, these percent decreases are the decreases in the Living Planet Index since 1970. And across the board, we are seeing, we are experiencing massive biodiversity loss. And of course, the specter of climate change is not going away, it's getting worse. And we are seeing huge impacts on all of our life systems and social and economic systems. So this is the backdrop for why we are really undergoing a planetary emergency, not just because of the global health pandemic, which is adding to this and is also part of it, but all of these other crises are confronting our planet and our society right now. And it's not a time to panic. It's a time to really think clearly about how to move forward and in a different way. So I like to think about restoration as a way to work out of this dilemma and to move into a much more safe operating space for society and for our planet. So first in this talk, I'm going to frame a bit about how I view the restoration challenge, and also talk about the nexus between the science that we do and also the important role for policy and practice and how these need to become more linked. I'm going to also address some specific areas in which scientific knowledge can contribute and is, I hope, already contributing to policy and practice with regard to restoration. And discuss also how we can advance the practice of restoration through infusion of information from case studies and scientific research to provide an evidence-based approach for moving forward. The other approach that is really needed, I believe, is a principles-based approach, and I'll describe that a little bit toward the end of the talk, as well as a focus on how we can move to really develop the capacities that we need to accomplish the kind of restoration that we need in our world. So in terms of framing the challenge here, my fundamental claim is that restoration is not the goal. It is not, you just don't go out and just do restoration because that's what you want to do. But restoration is a means toward achieving particular outcomes and particular ends. So it is an activity, it is a process. And it is not an inverse of deforestation. You just can't move that arrow and turn it around, or ecosystem degradation. Restoration involves different processes than those that led to the degradation in the first place. So that is why it is a process, and it should not be viewed as being accomplished simply by doing projects. We all need to do projects. We all have to do them for our work and for our degrees. But those projects need to fit into this larger scope of a process to really be, in my view, accomplishing restoration. And this really means that, yes, systemic change is needed to make the shift from what we have now, which are socio-ecological systems that are in degradative cycles that are continuing to get worse, being driven by many forces. We need to shift those into a new realm where we have resilient and productive socio-ecological systems. And this needs to happen at multiple scales, at local, at national, and at global scales. That's all we need to do. And we also, in order to take effective restoration actions, have to address the drivers that continue to cause ecosystem degradation. Because if we do not overcome and replace those drivers with other kinds of societal activities, we're only going to be seeing more and more degradation, and the restoration is not going to have a net positive benefit. So where I'm going is that restoration is really a system, and it's a process that has inputs and it has outputs. The inputs are shown here as if we're looking at a below ground, underground foundation. The inputs take the form of the stocks of capital that we have in terms of all of these different components of stocks. And they also take the form of enabling conditions that are needed to align activity and to produce effective action. These inputs then drive restoration initiatives, and the outputs come out. And those outputs can be viewed as either outcomes of long-term societal change and restoration benefits, such as mitigating climate change, conserving biodiversity, restoring ecosystem services, improving livelihoods, gains for people, food security, and overall human well-being. Those are what the outputs, that's what we want to do restoration for, and also to achieve the outcomes that are likened to the branches of this tree. These outputs will then produce conditions that feed back and improve enabling conditions and increase these capital stocks, which then drive further restoration activity. And this is a feed forward. This is the kind of restoration cycle that I'm talking about that we need to be keeping in mind, as this is where we want to go. So I mentioned the importance of understanding the drivers, and I want to emphasize here that my background is in forest, and so I'm going to be focusing most of my attention in this talk on forest loss and forest restoration, but I think that much of the thinking that I'm describing applies across the board to all ecosystems. But just keep in mind that I think mostly in terms of forests. So from 2000 to 2015, the world lost 314 million hectares of forest, but it didn't lose it all in the same way. There were many different factors that created that loss of forest. And when you break that down, as Curtis did in this important paper in 2018, you see that there's sort of an even distribution of these drivers, at least up until 2015. Commodity-driven deforestation for crop production that export commodities contributed only 27% of that forest loss. Another 24% came from shifting agriculture, 26% from forestry operations, which are also oriented toward maintaining forest cover. So yes, there's forest loss, but there's also forest management and forest gain in that process. And 23% from wildfire. I think that number has probably gone up substantially over the last couple of years. Only 1% of forest loss can be attributed to urbanization. And what's really important to know too is that those drivers are playing out differently in different parts of the world. For example, in Africa, you see yellow, which is representing the shifting agriculture as the main driver. Also true for Madagascar. And in these cases, we have more small scale types of clearing of forest for agriculture. In Indonesia and South America, on the other hand, you see red, which is commodity-driven deforestation. This is more long-term commitment of land to commercial and large-scale crop production, mostly for export. And that is a very different situation in terms of dealing with the impacts and how to even view that from a restoration perspective. And forestry operations contributing to forest loss, but also forest gain in more than the northern countries, temperate countries, as well as some parts of South America and Australia. So it's very important thinking about the existing deforestation situation, about what are these drivers, because we can't begin to undertake restoration without understanding and shifting those drivers to other types of forcing factors that will create the restorative motivation and actions. Also, in terms of degradation, we can also think about this at many different scales. And there's been a lot of the term degradation is so widely used along with recovery and restoration, but it needs to be grounded in a particular scale when we're thinking about it and doing it, because we have landscape scale of influences, ecosystem degradation, habitat degradation, and land degradation that are really different aspects, and they are all focusing on different functions. So if we have land degradation, we might be trying to do things to improve soil integrity, to improve water infiltration, and things like that. But at the ecosystem level, we're concerned with seed dispersal and gene flow and disturbance regimes, whereas at landscape scale, where these are functions that directly affect water regulation, erosion, mitigation of hazards like floods, as well as climate regulation. So this is important. Degradation and recovery occur at multiple scales. But there also are subjective judgments about what is degradation. And when you look at a landscape like this is in the Pico Bonito buffer zone, Pico Bonito National Park in Honduras. This used to be a completely forested landscape, not all that long ago. But would you say it's degraded? And some people would look at this landscape and say, no, there's some really good farming activity going on here. People are making a living. This isn't degradation. who decides what is degraded? When we do restoration, we have to make a decision about where and how to restore. And there will be losers and there will be winners based on that decision. And a lot of that comes down to the original judgment about what is degradation and what should be happening on that land and who makes that decision. So that for practice and policy, those are super important issues. And I've been very motivated by this beautiful illustration that accompanied a paper I wrote in the magazine Current Conservation that got me thinking a lot about this nexus. And what I mean here is that we have sort of a triangle. At one corner, we have the researchers who work with theory, concepts, understanding how systems work and operate, right? Then we have, in this corner, we have policymakers. They are developing targets, setting targets. They define different governance approaches. They deal with finance of public funds and how to provide incentives for different kinds of activity. And then over here, we have the people who are actually directly engaged, the practitioners. They are involved in planning and implementation and in many cases in monitoring of what happens with restoration. And this is the citation to the paper in Current Conservation. So these different groups all have different focuses of their activity, but they are really interdependent on each other. And a lot of the thinking for this came out of the Partners Network. As Yadvinder mentioned, this activity is no longer funded, but we still continue to work together as best we can. We have made this website that I invite you to look at called partnersrcn.org, where we provide a lot of the summaries of over 50 research papers that we've written together, and taking a very interdisciplinary approach that focuses on these 12 main aspects that you see here. And each of these really involves interdisciplinary synthesis. And the point here is that in order to really understand, sort of from even just the scientific perspective, all of the issues regarding restoration and different forms and interventions it could take and where it's needed and what the outcomes would be, really require a broad interdisciplinary perspective. And not only that, but including people, including policy-oriented people and practitioners in the mix with scientists has really enabled us to see, have a much more clear vision of where we need to go. So some of the main knowledge gaps came out of some of the syntheses from partners, but also some of the work that I've been recently engaged in. And one of those gaps is really understanding how can we assess the costs and benefits of restoration. And that also includes the feasibility. So social costs and what factors might help restoration to happen. Enabling factors. Second, how and where can restoration achieve multiple social and environmental outcomes? We don't want restoration that is not being very effective. We want to be able to achieve more than one thing whenever possible, and the best levels of those things. And what are the outcomes, both in terms of social outcomes and environmental outcomes, and that restoration has? So we need to really document and find ways of describing and quantifying these outcomes and understanding how those came about. And on the other hand, on the other end of drivers, what are the social and environmental factors that best promote or that hinder implementation of particular restoration measures? And finally, how can we incorporate new technologies and innovations at the same time that we are also building on traditional and indigenous or local knowledge? So we have to have an open mind about trying out some new things, but we also realize that there's a wealth of information already that's relevant that we need to bring to bear. And when we start looking at opportunities for restoration, we see that there's just so much area to restore And there's a huge urgency that we have to really begin this process as soon as possible. But there's also not enough money to do what we need to do. And we also don't have an adequate flow of information to decision makers and practitioners that really need tools. They need tools to help support their decisions, and they need tools to help them implement effective and long-lasting restoration. And a lot of those need to come from the theory and the science. This is a way of thinking about it that I think will motivate a lot of the research that I'm going to be showing you now. And it's just a way of assessing the costs and benefits of restoration and what kinds of interventions and approaches might be most relevant. So on the x-axis is a measure of opportunity cost. This could be the income that could come in from existing land uses, or some other feasibility measure like land tenure, or even security. On the x-axis is a measure of the potential for restoration to provide high benefits. And this has to be referenced to a particular aspect. And I'd like to just use the example of recovery of biodiversity as a restoration benefit in this case. So we have a situation here where we have a low opportunity cost. For example, we have land that may have been abandoned that isn't even being used for agriculture anymore. So there's no income coming in. But there's a very high potential on this land for recovery of biodiversity. So I would argue this is a very good situation for promoting natural regeneration of forests. It's already happening. There's no claim to this land. Let's let the forest regrow. On the other hand, you could have low opportunity costs, but it's not a good situation for recovery of biodiversity. And in this situation, we would suggest some kind of commercial tree plantation that would provide more benefits for local people, and it would provide some ecological benefits as well. Now, when we have high opportunity cost, there's a need for continuing to gain income from agricultural use of the land. But in this situation, we also have a potential high ability to support and to recover biodiversity, or in a landscape context to provide connectivity. And this could be accomplished with agroforestry, for example, in this case with a coffee plantation with trees. And these could be fruit trees, or they could just be native trees in the area. A variety of timber products could be developed with this kind of system. Now you have this corner where we have a very high opportunity cost. We tend to find this in these types of large-scale agriculture for export, commodity agriculture landscapes. There's been a huge investment, and we have extensive areas, and they're producing a lot of income and product. And they also are not really good situations for restoring biodiversity because there is very little native habitat in that vicinity. So I would say these are really not high priorities, or maybe should not even be priorities for restoring biodiversity at least. But they could be important priorities for improving agricultural policies and improving sustainability of agriculture and improving climate resilience of agriculture. Also, we find this around urban areas. We may here be promoting more gardens, home gardens, or other sustainability, food security for the urban population, rather than trying to restore native forests in this kind of situation. So I think this thinking allows us to kind of think about the world as all of the different pixels in the world as sort of belonging in each of these categories. I know that's a gross oversimplification, but we can begin to start looking at where are the benefits likely to be high for restoration, and where do we have to deal with the costs. This is just a diagram to illustrate that there are different strategies involved in forest restoration. And I'm not advocating, I think they all have their place and importance under different contexts. And they all provide different kinds of benefits. And this is where we need to balance and consider what are the needs and what is the suitability of the land for each of these different types of restoration strategies. For example, planting forests, using native species for conservation, that actually may provide, that is actually most expensive because you need to grow those seedlings in a nursery and pay for all of the upkeep and maintenance. But that kind of intervention may provide more benefits, more social benefits, but it also may have a higher risk of failure. So these are all different aspects that we don't have a lot of concrete data on. These are more the qualitative estimates of the relative costs and benefits. But we do know a lot from our scientific work that is actually beginning to understand how different types of restoration interventions influence, in this particular study, recovery of biodiversity. And this study looked at different groups of organisms in studies where there had been natural regeneration and also studies with active restoration, and compared the biodiversity in these areas with forests that had not been disturbed, or reference forests within the same vicinity or landscape. And what we found in this research was that when we compared recovery of vegetation structure and biodiversity, the natural regeneration sites were much closer to the reference forests than were the actively restored sites, for both of these measures. And this is really one of the first examples and first efforts to understand, do we need to do active restoration under conditions where natural regeneration could do the job? And that is not necessarily going to be everywhere in the world. As I mentioned before, there are conditions where natural regeneration is not going to happen or would not happen well at all. But where it can happen well, there's no reason to expect that planting trees is going to do a better job of recovering biodiversity or vegetation structure. This then points to the need to identify areas where there is this high biophysical potential for natural regeneration, but also where we have feasibility factors that would favor this kind of restoration pattern, which here we're just calling high socioeconomic feasibility. And to also assess assess the potential for different restoration approaches to actually store carbon, which is one of the important needs that we have, and both above and below ground and in different geographic regions. So these are the third research advance that we've been making, is to actually use spatial data and modeling approaches that allow us to identify priority areas that don't just maximize one aspect, but that allow us to maximize multiple benefits of restoration, and also to minimize the costs that might require for implementation, and also the opportunity costs. So I want to just give you some examples from recent work on these topics. And the first one is a study in the Atlantic forest of restoration that looked across the entire Brazil's expanse of Atlantic forest to ask the question, where could we target restoration using natural regeneration? That is, could we map this potential within this large area? And in order to do that, we used existing data from the past 20 years to understand where natural regeneration has already happened. So this is a proof of concept. It's already happened in these areas. And we discovered 2.7 million hectares of forest had come back on their own. We eliminated plantations, we eliminated active restoration plantings. And what we were left with were areas that had just come back on their own for a variety of reasons. These are located in this inset map here in the brown. And you can see in the green areas are forest fragments, and many parts of the Atlantic forest have extensive small forest fragments in them. It's been highly fragmented, but these fragments are hugely important and contribute a lot to the remaining forest cover in this area. And it turns out that most of the regenerating forests have regrown in very close proximity, either on the edge or very close to these existing forest fragments. We looked at the predictors of whether forests regenerated or not, so presence or absence of natural regeneration, and what were the spatial predictors of that. And we found that it was being close to a forest fragment. 90% of the regenerating forest areas were within 192 meters of a forest or a forest fragment. With that predictive information, we made a model to predict where natural regeneration had a high capacity, assuming this would be over the next 20 years. And this is assuming, of course, that the conditions are similar to how they were during the first 20 years. So that is an assumption that we made in applying the model. But we found that 2.8 million hectares, about as much as we had in the first 20 years, could undergo natural regeneration by the year 2035. And another 18.8 million hectares showed sort of moderate potential for natural regeneration, meaning that we could use some assisted regeneration methods to help that process along without needing to resort to a full tree planting regime. If we were then to use these strategic guidance, we could reduce the implementation costs for the goal of restoring forests in the Atlantic forest. We could reduce those costs by $90 billion. So obviously we have a huge guidance here from our scientific research that policymakers are taking up now in Brazil in terms of deciding where to do active restoration, where active restoration measures are needed, and where assisted natural regeneration, which is shown in the blue here, could really accomplish the job. Now, since this is the responsibility of landowners to do within Brazil, obviously landowners would much rather pay less to restore forests on their land. So this is hugely important for motivating the landowners to adopt restoration measures that could be very effective, but will cost them much less. Now, we've also been looking at more qualitative outcomes of natural regeneration. So not going beyond just the presence or absence to look at actual how biodiversity recovers in regenerating forests, which has been an interest of mine for many, many years. And this used the same metadata that Renato Cruzeles has been able to pull out from studies all over the world. We looked at data representing 32 different landscapes where the average age of the naturally regenerating forest was about 53 years old. We had a wide range of age of forests. And we looked at different taxa, birds, invertebrates, plants, mammals, and herpetofauna. So this is all published data that was pulled together, not our own originally collected data. And we looked at whatever data was measured in the studies. It was usually abundance or species richness, in some cases species diversity measures that were in these regenerating sites compared to reference forests. And then we calculated the deviation, these response ratios, the deviation of those sites within a particular landscape. And we then considered the fact that having a low deviation in these response ratios could be interpreted as having a higher likelihood that multiple sites in this landscape would recover biodiversity in this regenerating forest compared to the reference forest. So we have our response variable here at the landscape scale was the deviation in these response ratios. And what we found is that the deviation in that response ratio tended to be very high in landscapes that had very low forest cover. And we looked at different radiuses and we found that the 5-kilometer radius gave us our best fit to this model. So areas that had higher forest cover in the surrounding these secondary forests had a lower variation, a lower deviation in their restoration success. meaning they had a higher overall expectation of recovery. Using a similar metric, we then looked more closely at a range of other drivers, including socioeconomic drivers, biophysical and ecological factors, and how these were all affecting, both directly and indirectly affecting biodiversity recovery. And we also looked at climate, economic and political factors, land use covered and change, population and development metrics, and soils and topography, as well as the effect of time on recovery of biodiversity. And this paper was just published recently in Conservation Letters. And I don't have a lot of time to go into the results, but we found direct effects on biodiversity recovery as measured by this deviation of forest cover, cropland cover, and urban cover in these landscapes. And here where you see a negative effect, that means forest cover led to a lower deviation, and the lower deviation in our framework means a higher overall likelihood of recovery. So increasing forest cover in the landscape, and in our particular set of landscapes, increasing cropland cover, were linked to higher levels of biodiversity recovery in those secondary forests. Now, urban had the opposite effect. So landscapes that had a higher percentage of urban areas showed higher deviation, lower levels of biodiversity recovery. We also found a variety of other factors. I won't have time to go into this in too much detail, that were affecting the forest cover, the cropland cover, and the urban cover. So we kind of have a two-stage direct effects as well as indirect effects on biodiversity recovery in this structural equation model. But it's important to realize that forests regenerate at very different rates around the world. This is an image from just a few kilometers down the road where a massive forest fire completely eliminated forests 20 years ago. And you can see there are some areas where the forest has recovered, beginning to recover, and many tiny little tree seedlings all over the place. But this is 20 years, which for me, after working in the tropics, was just really mind-blowing. So the ability of forests to recover is a huge amount of variation. And that's important to understand in planning restoration around the world, especially if one of the main goals of restoration is to increase carbon storage. So this study that was also recently published, it was led by Susan Cook-Patton. We took data, gathered data from all over the world and looked at what are the rates of recovery of biomass and above ground carbon storage during the first 30 years when forests are regrowing naturally, using data from all over the world. And we found 100-fold variation in those rates across different biomes of the world. And here's just some, these are the means across all of the different biomes that we looked at in terms of temperate boreal biomes, which had the lowest rates of above ground biomass recovery. Subtropical also had fairly lower rates compared to the tropics, both the dry tropics and the wet tropics. We also interestingly found that our average predicted rates for each of these zones were higher than those that are being used in the IPCC modeling defaults. So we think it's time to incorporate some more recent information now in the IPCC models. With that information, now you can then look at that map, but just in terms of highlighting those areas where forests have been removed. So these are potential sites for restoring forests. And now planners can use this information to understand how within their geographic regions, how they can best maximize carbon storage through natural regeneration in those regions. And again, that does mean also being able to account for the potential for natural regeneration to happen in those areas. So the third approach is one that we've been using both in the Atlantic forest of Brazil and now more recently in a global study that takes a systematic approach to prioritization. And this approach allows you to evaluate multiple benefits or costs of restoration within the same model? And how can we optimize these? This is because there are trade-offs. So here in the Atlantic forest, you can see in this diagram, our goals were threefold: to avoid extinctions of species that had limited geographic ranges, to store carbon in above ground biomass, and to reduce the cost. So we wanted to look at where could all three of these things be optimized within the Atlantic forest. And the total costs that you see here are indicated by different colors on these bars. And these bars show the trade-off between areas that would do best at avoiding extinctions and areas that would do best for storing carbon. And the idea is to have a compromise solution that would allow us to do the best we possibly could for storing carbon and avoiding extinctions, and doing that at the lowest possible cost. These maps that you see here simply show the maps. This is for biodiversity alone. All of these red areas are areas here on this map that maximize biodiversity recovery or avoiding extinction. So these would be the hotspots to restore for that goal. Here, this is the goal of storing carbon. So these areas in yellow would store the most carbon. In this graph, the purple are areas that would be restored for the lowest cost. That is, they're more likely to come back just through natural regeneration without requiring tree planting or minimal assistance. And now this is the compromise solution here that was enabled by the model. And the compromise solution finds an 8-fold increase in cost effectiveness for biodiversity conservation compared with a non-systemic or baseline for restoration, which would be where each farmer is restoring on their own farms as required by law. Okay. So if we take a strategic approach, we can find that the benefits for the goals, reaching the goals, can be accomplished much better when we do this systemic approach rather than distributing the restoration effort all across on individual farms. We've done a similar approach recently at the global scale that was just published in Nature earlier this month. And this is the same multi-criteria optimization approach. And we looked at priority areas for restoration. But in this case, not just forests, we also included shrublands and wetlands and grasslands in the analysis. And we again looked at these where were priority areas that solved the multiple problem of protecting biodiversity, mitigating climate change through carbon storage, and minimizing costs, and all combinations thereof. This was our map that based on the compromise solution. And you can see in deep red, these were the top areas where we could maximize all three. We could protect biodiversity, store the most carbon, and do this at the least cost in these areas that you see here in the bright red. Now, we're not deciding where to do this. We're simply putting this information out and saying, okay, those people who want to plan restoration, you might want to take this into account if you want to achieve multiple benefits, especially if these are areas within your country. And according to the Aichi targets or whatever their future form may take, we could use this information to look at the top 30% or the top 15%. This kind of prioritization can also be done. We also did it at national level. And we certainly found that you get much better bang for your buck if we do this at a global prioritization level, because we're finding the very best options globally. But countries also need to find their very best solutions nationally, even though they are falling short of what we could accomplish globally. And this is really an interesting tension, because this is a global problem. Biodiversity loss and climate change are global problems, but we don't have a good global solution for them. So I want to go back to this restoration system idea, and I mentioned here that the kind of restoration benefits that we've been including in these models are just these top two: climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation. there are many other important benefits that need to be brought out, produced by restoration. And those also need to be modeled and incorporated into these kinds of spatial models. So now I'd like to turn to how we can orient this information toward improving practice and policy. And need I say more, there's evidence of huge global concern and interest and activity in this arena. Also from the perspective of nature-based solutions, which is now embracing all the forms of restoration that I've mentioned here, as well as other types of nature-based solutions that will conserve biodiversity, will also mitigate climate change, will also help to adapt to climate change and reduce disaster risks. And then here, which you can't quite read, I'm sorry to say, but these are all different important ecosystem services: food security, food production, flood control, all kinds of other important considerations, medicinal uses, genetic diversity, production of fresh water. All of those need to be part of nature-based solutions. And of course, we are about to initiate the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So there's a huge interest in applying the scientific information to improving practice and policy. But I would say we're not quite ready. I don't want to wait another 10 years, but we just need to recognize that there have been some issues with the science. First of all, the traction on the ground has been very slow. So yes, you could blame this on the practitioners, but it's also due to many other important obstacles. Traction progress has been inadequately documented. We have very little information about what's really going on and very poor communication about it. In almost all cases, when restoration is being planned, they don't have they don't have a model. They usually perform and plan that ad hoc with whatever materials they can get, with whatever experts they can, if they even have experts involved. Or maybe they're doing this on their own and they already know from traditional practice how to do that. But we have inadequate knowledge to really deliver and predict outcomes and benefits. Many interventions fail to achieve objectives, and most of these failures are never discussed. This is a project that you never hear about. Project scale interventions are usually driven by short-term objectives with deliverables on a very short time scale and no long-term assessment of outcomes. We don't have a robust and accessible evidence base for guiding restoration practice or policy. And we need one. And we also lack really operational working frameworks to help get implementation going and to also monitor. And these should be based on the core principles of restoration. And we haven't done very much to get rid of these drivers and to eliminate them. We're still seeing very high rates of deforestation and forest degradation around the world, particularly in the tropics. So need I say more? We are still not addressing the drivers of deforestation by taking restoration actions. So I'll get on my soapbox now and tell you that this is something I've been really pushing a lot over the last couple of years, that we really need to put together an evidence base for restoration. And we also need to provide access to knowledge and tools that will help implement both effective and long-lasting action with restoration. The kind of database that I'm envisioning is very accessible. It would have detailed case studies and also a database from that to guide and inform the full scope of restoration practices, outcomes, and very importantly, the lessons learned. And third, to put this on a global platform that also is highlighting where different types of restoration activities are being implemented based on other spatially referenced information, including remote sensing information, and also that provides other links to resources and information. We don't have this right now. And I put this together for another talk a while back, but I really like the slide because it's, we can't go and find the kit for forest and landscape restoration that's going to tell us how to set it up and implement successful practices, increase the likelihood of successful landscape outcomes, and to navigate the institutional bureaucracy and reporting requirements. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to doing restoration, and we really need to provide guidelines for a process, and that process has to take into account all of the local context issues. So I mentioned the importance of principles here. These are the 8 principles that the Society for Ecological Restoration has produced. And they really are important for guiding restoration. They underpin what it is that restoration is trying to do. And if the activities that are undertaken do not conform with these principles, then we can rightly say that is not restoration, okay? And you'll notice here that this doesn't really say resolving the drivers of degradation, okay? That is not one of these 8 principles. These are the 6 principles that are now adopted by the Global Partnership on Forest Landscape Restoration for FLR. And of course, this is a landscape level approach that restores multiple landscape functions tailored to local context, does have one of its foundations maintaining and enhancing natural ecosystems and avoiding further degradation, engaging stakeholders, and managing for long-term resilience. So if activities do not conform to these principles, then they really should not be called FLR. But also nature-based solutions have come up with principles, these 4 very basic and important solutions. And now there's a standard out there for, am I conforming to these? And now here's a recently produced guidelines for forest landscape restoration in the tropics by ITTO, using the 6 principles of forest landscape restoration that I just showed you. And they have come up with 32 guiding elements that are linked to these principles that are really important guidance for practitioners and also for policymakers. So we have made a lot of progress defining the principles and how they can be operationalized. And one of the things that we really need to work on is the groups that want to practice forest landscape restoration, whether they're local communities, subnational organizations, or even at the national level, is to sit down and come up with a framework for how we're going to do that based on the principles. And we outlined in this paper a path forward to how we can begin to do that. Because right now, even though we may have guidelines and we might have some documents that prescribe good practices, this doesn't really provide the kind of guidebook that we need to really be implementing forest landscape restoration and to ensure that it is really following these core principles. So I think this argues very much that we are, one of the major efforts that we need to engage in is developing capacities all across the board. And this includes enhancing ability of individuals, family units, communities, organizations, agencies, companies, and institutions of all kinds, government and non-government institutions, to take action to really transform degraded socio-ecological systems, as I showed you earlier, into beautiful, restored, and resilient and productive systems that we all want and will make us all happy. And how do we do this? Well, we have to strengthen those foundations, as I showed in the diagram: natural capital, human capital, social capital, cultural capital, political capital, financial capital, and built capital. All of those need to be moving in the same direction and aligning at local, national, and global scales with the goal of building a more sustainable world. All right, we have a chance now to really make our world better. If we don't, we're going to see some extremely serious consequences. So the UN Decade Task Force was developed as part of the UN Decade, and it is led by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. And in forming this task force, they invited people from outside of FAO to become involved. So I, through my consulting company, Forestation International, raised my hand and I said, I want to be involved in the capacity needs assessment. We have a lot of other people involved, including people from WRI as well. And we are developing a questionnaire that is going to go out. You'll hopefully hear about it later. We actually presented this at the Global Landscape Forum a couple of days ago. We want to really engage people at all levels, grassroots, all the way up through the highest level of government, to find out what they think are the biggest needs for capacity to get to where they think they should be, where we would like to be. And we really, this effort, I think, is going to lead to the next part of the task force, which is to develop a knowledge and learning plan and a capacity enhancement strategy to help guide the decade. And that is something I'm interested in being engaged in as well. And we would like to involve other people. And if you're interested, please get in touch with me. We still need people to help evaluate our pilot questionnaire, as well as to work on the results when they come in. So back to this nexus, I think I have begun to see some clear ways in which scientists, researchers can become engaged with policy and practice, and also how policy and practice can influence what we do with our research. That's hugely important. Just to talk about four main aspects, because I'm wrapping up. We need principles and guidelines and working frameworks, and we need to have these based in good science. We need to build an evidence base. This is extremely important because we can't go blindly into doing restoration thinking we know what might work. We actually know what works in many cases. That information has just not been pulled together. And it will also clearly show what we don't know and what we need to do more work on. We need to develop capacity at all levels. And we need to provide better tools for decision-making and implementation that will really help policymakers and practitioners to engage effectively with restoration. So in conclusion, I'd like to just wrap up with a few key points. We've been seeing degradation for decades or centuries, and reversing this is not just simply taking that arrow and flipping it around. We really need to change the drivers of economic activity and political activity around the world. We need systemic change. I'm not the only one who is saying this. And we need this to build back better and to recover from COVID and to also solve many societal problems. We need this for restoration as well. Restoration is a societal problem. And it's not going to be quick. It may take centuries, but we need to get started on this and do what we can now. It's important to evaluate trade-offs. We can't ignore them because they need to be negotiated, and we need to understand how activity that's done for one purpose affects other functions. We see a lot of quick fix efforts going on now, particularly with tree planting. Many of these are likely to fail, and their failure risks the loss of trust, which is social capital, and they also risk waste of financial capital. And we can't afford to be wasting. We need to be building these capitals instead of breaking them down. Local people need to be involved, actively engaged, and benefit from restoration efforts. And I like to call this scaling deep. So it's not just a question of large scale or scaling out, but we really need to scale deep so that the restoration becomes part of the culture and becomes part of the benefits that people expect and they want to participate in it. As I mentioned in many of my presentation slides earlier, we need to leverage the capacity for natural regeneration and understand where that exists and what factors can predict it so that we can make the most of our restoration opportunities. And not only where it's biophysically possible, but also where it's socio and economically possible and feasible. And that also involves changing some regulations in governments, some of their forest policy about secondary forests. And finally, in terms of the spatial planning and the kind of prioritization models that I talked about, we really need to include more of those benefits on the list and incorporate more social dimensions. And those are far less understood and less available as spatial variables. So thank you very much. I'll take some questions now.
Okay, thank you very much, Robin. That was terrific. So I'd like to invite the audience to post questions into the chat box, or even just very briefly, just summarizing what you'd like to talk about. And then I'll invite you to, if possible, switch on your video and your microphone and directly ask those questions. It's nice to see faces and have interaction here. If you can't do that, just indicate in your message that your microphone isn't working or it's not appropriate, and then I can field those questions to Robin directly. I'd like to just kick off with a question while we're waiting for some more in the chat box. Robin, thank you for that. I think it was a very useful reality check on the complexity of restoration when we hear these ambitious targets and goals. But one of the challenges of this, what could be said is your realistic assessment of what is needed and the transformation that is needed, is that takes time. And the challenge is that the nature-based solution argument for nature-based solutions for climate mitigation may in some ways don't have that time. They argue that we need these negative carbon emissions in the next few decades while the fundamental fossil fuel problem is solved, and the parts of our emissions that we can't directly draw down quickly. So if restoration to any significant level is working on a much longer time scale, which has lots of other benefits, does that really fundamentally mean that the core of that climate mitigation argument for restoration is actually quite weak, that it simply can't respond on the timescales that are needed to address some of our more ambitious climate targets?
Yeah. Well, I do think that some of the benefits for carbon mitigation would happen sooner. And some of these benefits will play out. There will be an initial benefit, and then the benefits will increase and grow over time. What's important in doing some of these more mitigation-oriented activities is that we don't reduce those other capitals in the process, because then we're knocking back the enabling factors for restoration, for really doing the long-term work that's needed. So I think there needs to be a strategy in place to, and those 4 principles are a beginning, to align some of these more short-term focused mitigation approaches with long-term restoration, and to make sure that those are moving in the same direction and improving social capital and human capital at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll start inviting people from the chat box. Manan, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Chazdon, for your talk. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the nature study event, which came out recently. And then you also referred to some of your own work in the Atlantic forest. And I just wanted to ask, because I also read the nature study recently, and through their sort of methodology, when they combine biophysical potential and socioeconomic feasibility, it is often the case that, densely populated tropical areas are considered ripe for reforestation or restoration. And I'm wondering, I mean, that's not, I mean, is there a way to consider how just and equitable that restoration might well be? Because I'm not sure what kind of message that gives out, especially in a high impact, like super collaborative study like that. And then you compare that with some of your own work in the Atlantic forest, which is much more deeper and you can consider much more. But in these studies, I'm wondering what kind of message that gives out when densely populated tropical areas are considered ripe in terms of equity and justice.
So obviously, we're not proposing that in these areas that are in bright red, we kick all of the population out so we can restore ecosystems. First of all, the guidelines right now are 15%. They could go up to 30% in some cases. That's just a guideline. The idea is that when you're looking for places to restore and where there's public will and where there's community engagement, where could we do this to also receive these other benefits? And by the way, these benefits will also improve agricultural productivity, will help to mitigate and adapt to climate change, and will make these, but we hope, improve food security, So they're also very relevant for highly populated areas. It's not necessary to take a broad brush and say all of those areas should be restored. The guidelines are, maybe 15% or slightly more. And then that the rest of those percentages could be made up for in other areas where that may not be the highest benefits for biodiversity or ecosystem services, but they may be providing other kinds of benefits for local people. So it's very clear that I don't think there's a prescription in our paper that at all says that we should ignore the needs of local populations.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so over to Vivek. Would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. I'm following Manon's question. I'm thinking when we overlap these Human Development Index trends of various regions, especially in developing countries and underdeveloped countries, the problem there is mainly with respect to social well-being. So when we go there for forest restoration or ecological activities, ecological rebuilding activities, the problem here is, are we compensating, are we even giving daily wages at right proportion, which is needed for their daily, everyday livelihood? Are we meeting their basic needs, education needs? Are the restoration projects considering intersectionality? Are they bringing in educational infrastructures needed for local communities or their hospital facilities? Are we going in an integrated way, or we are focusing only on ecological activities alone? So I don't know, when there is huge need among social system there, how far it is going to be successful only going with ecological prioritization alone. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. No, I absolutely understand your point, and none of us believe that the ultimate decisions on implementation of restoration should be made exclusively on biophysical priorities. I think that we had limitations for data for social and economic data that we could apply at the global scale in this kind of model. But that kind of information, if it's available at smaller scales, could be incorporated in national or subnational models that would highlight opportunities that take a lot of other information into account. I also want to emphasize that this is why I support forest and landscape restoration rather than strictly ecological restoration. That I think within the FLR concept, this also includes a lot of other land uses that are compatible with restoration, that improve food security. I'm involved in some work in the Philippines that's really focused on improving food security and water security and watersheds through landscape restoration. So it doesn't it means a new way of viewing land use at the landscape scale that is trying to balance all kinds of different needs. It's not completely focused only on restoring native ecosystems. And I think this is especially in populated areas where there are food security or water security issues. This is the only way to move forward and to engage the populations very actively in the decisions that are made, what trees are planted or what kinds of agroforestry operations are put in place, and to really have them take ownership of this entire operation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Simona, would you like to elaborate on your question in person? Are you there, Simona? Okay. If you can't hear, I'm not quite sure exactly what that question is. I can't sort of relay it. So I'll move on to Clara's question. Clara, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks a lot. Thank you, Robin Chazdon. I would like to know if we could use the existing knowledge, because many systems already manage in a sustainable way and have all the recipes that you mentioned, like local people involvement, multiple benefits, and so on. So why don't we use these systems as reference? And is there actually already some project doing that, or what might be the limitations of doing that?
Yes, that's a really great question. And yes, there are some projects that are doing that, particularly in Africa. There's a project that ECRAF has been operating for quite some years. There's also the farmer managed natural regeneration that is really based on local knowledge of how to prune trees and how to get trees to regrow from root sprouts in dryland areas and also in other areas. So there's a huge amount of local knowledge that is in many cases being used to, in some cases, the restoration really is also kind of bringing back some traditional practices that may have been ignored or are not practiced for many years due to other pressures. So I see restoration as really also, so this cultural capital component is really hugely important to engage people who have this local and indigenous knowledge to apply these practices and within a broader context of landscape restoration.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll read out Shyam's as his microphone's not working. Do we have enough knowledge of regeneration seed traits of native species that need higher priority in restoration at local scale?
Well, if you look, we did a study of this in the Atlantic forest and looked at the seed traits of the species that were being outplanted and grown in nurseries. And we found they did not, they were biased toward species that had smaller seeds, that you got more seeds per dollar or per real to purchase them. And they also tended to be not as representative of the larger animal dispersed species, which are very important ecologically. Those are more expensive to harvest, and they also tend to grow more slowly. There are things you can do to increase the use of these species in restoration, but we do find many cases the species that are used in planting programs, there may be 5 or 6 species that account for 90% of the trees that are planted. We often see a very low diversity. They tend to be things that have been around in nurseries for a long time. They may not have good genetic diversity. So there's a real need to focus on improving both the quality and the ecological traits of the species that are being planted in restoration.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in. Pietro, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Chazdon. It was really great. Well, my question is about the methodology used. Could you comment on that more specifically? Well, on the methodology used for spatial modeling. Well, am I right by saying that you use multi-criteria decision analysis for that, and like what one should use, to implement the same approach like on the local scale? Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for that question. I wasn't the person who did the modeling, but I know a bit about it. And we used a linear programming model that was created for this research, largely led by Hawthorne Bayer in Australia, at the University of Queensland, who, and this allows for precise solutions. And each of those models gives, many different solutions. And then you look for the ones that optimize all three. That approach was used for both the Atlantic forest and the global. It's not an algorithm that's out there for use at this point, but the Plangia platform has been created that allows anybody to go in and tweak some of those components, how much you want to emphasize biodiversity or how much you want to emphasize carbon storage and cost. So we're making that tool available for policymakers to use at different geographic scales. In the future, the group at IIS is really interested in developing decision support tools that don't require a PhD or 2 PhDs to operate them. So I think you can look forward to some of those tools coming out in the future.
Thank you. If I may I ask another question, actually, like following us from the different area?
Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, well, you presented like the global outlook on restoration necessity based on the criteria that you have developed. And I wonder if, like, in the fragmented world, will the humanity focus on this global approach in global scale and prioritize restoration activities on global scale? Or it will be like subject to the interest of national governments that will focus on their special needs? Actually, do you actually believe, like, in this, like, the robust intergovernmental agenda in terms of regulation of restoration activity?
Well, no, I think you're right. In the end, the action is going to have to take place at the national scale, and there will be national priorities that don't follow what we came up with, for sure. I do think that highlighting some of these global priorities can feed into national agendas. So, for example, arguing that these countries should receive more support from the GEF or the World Bank or the Global Climate Fund or whatever new fund might appear, including Bill Gates and all of these people who are now allocating even private money. So we have some places where we can immediately go to say, let's look more closely at these countries and see if they're interested in getting something started. And there's a lot of donors here that are interested because they are concerned about these global issues. So I do think it can work in favor of countries, by not unduly influencing their priorities, but looking at where those align with the global concerns. That's my hope.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll just follow up with a related question. So when you look at your map of global restoration, inevitably the highest bang for your buck is in the tropics, I presume because of the high biodiversity and probably the lower land prices as well coming into your optimization. And and I'm very sympathetic to that, as you would guess. But in that global thing, it does tend to perhaps disincentivize work, say, in the temperate biomes, like in Northern Europe, where there's a great need for ecosystem restoration. But this optimization, when it's done at a global level, always tends to favor tropical countries. And you could argue there's a justice and equity issue there as well, that all this focus going into the tropics when there's a need to undo millennia of damage at higher latitudes. And so, partially, I'd just like to know your reaction on that and what you think. And partially, as a practical tool, I imagine it's quite straightforward for your global assessment to also be done at a biome level using exactly the same tool, but say staying within the temperate forest biome, where would be the priorities for restoration, etc. And that would be a logical step. So would you respond to that?
I think that, we don't think that we have the last word on this. I think partly the value of the kind of study we did is to show what could be done, and it could be done at different scales. And we did a study, I didn't even have time to talk about, just looking at tropical moist forest biome that came out with Pedro Brancaleon that came out last year. And there, I think, we highlighted some countries that just have a very small part of this, but they have a very high hotspot area for restoration that they may not have known about. So I do think we could certainly, by no means is the goal to disincentivize restoration outside of the tropics. I think there's hugely important reasons to restore forests all over the world and other ecosystems as well, not to mention coastal and marine ecosystems, which we didn't include in our study. And those need to be done at the national level as well as at the biome level. And I think what we can find is we can find some alignment where a lot of these different studies point to the same regions, and maybe they point to different regions. So maybe we can have different criteria for restoring in certain areas. And that's the policy decision. That's not the role of the scientists really to say. I do think that we can provide policy useful results. But again, it's really the priorities of the countries that are important. But we also, this is also a global issue, and I do think we need to elevate the need for solutions at the global scale. And I agree that our expectations should be modest, but I do think that it's high time we actually started having some global initiatives that had teeth and that had really strong incentives that work.
Okay, thank
But
you.
don't ask me to come up with those.
Okay, okay, Kate Dutil, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering where rewilding fits into your conception of FLR frameworks, in particular reintroduction of like mega herbivores.
I'm sorry, can you ask your question again? I was reading a question on the screen.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering where or if rewilding fits into your conception of FLR frameworks, especially in relation to mega herbivores.
Yes, I think it can. I think there are some issues in highly populated areas where introducing megafauna or other kinds of animals could create some really serious conflicts. And so I think rewilding is often applied more to protected areas or areas where there isn't farming or ranching. There can be conflicts there with landowners, and that has to be managed as part of the project. But definitely, I do think finding areas for rewilding is very important. And I view the distinction as rewilding as more about restoration, but from a vertebrate perspective, a megavertebrate perspective.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Erica, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Robin.
Hi.
Talk. Nice to see you. So I have a question which is related to the implementation and the feasibility for it to be long-term, because lots of the hotspots for restoration are countries with high political instability. I mean, you know, that I'm referring particularly to Brazil. So how do you see it being long-term, as it depends on short-term governments to make long-term commitments that are not necessarily followed up?
Obviously, those are huge obstacles to more institutionally based restoration. I think the solution there is grassroots and community efforts need to be strengthened so that at minimum, those kinds of restoration activities that are directly improving local livelihoods can happen. I think NGOs can play a very important role in helping and encouraging or marketing products potentially from some of these areas. I do think it takes a holistic perspective and a bottom-up perspective in many cases. That's the only way to keep things going when governments fail and try to derail a lot of these types of activities. And I think the perseverance of people is needed, and you know their lives depend on it. And I think there's a lot of support for them. We need to increase that support hugely in the face of the governments not providing it.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I'll try and go through all of these. I'll randomly pick them in a random order though. So Daniel Oberhauser, that's an interesting question. Would you like to pose your question? Oh, sorry, you have no microphone. I'll pose this one for you. As a policymaker responsible for restoration in Germany, I have to deal with prioritizing funding, including research. Do you believe funds are best allocated at outcome or landscape level, or should we rather shift the focus of restoration to underlying societal issues and drivers? Is there sufficient research that aims at identifying the most important leverage points?
I do think there's been an overemphasis on some of these targets that are not based on outcomes. And I think that has the potential to lead to perverse outcomes that are going to affect social capital and human capital that we don't want to lose. We really need to be building those up and also building capacities across the board. So, which is often, capacity building is often neglected and sort of like, you know, oh, if we have any money left over, let's do that in our final year. Or let's have a transition plan for this project that puts it in the hands of local communities. These considerations should be upfront and they should be emphasized. So I do think the outcomes at landscape scale are hugely important. And that's where we need to, we do have some information. I think we have ability to go partway on that, to predict outcomes better so that we can have reasonable expectations and begin to use those as targets. I do think that in the new formulation of the biodiversity targets of the CBD, there's going to be an increased emphasis on outcomes, less than, you know, the number of hectares or the percentages of land used, to emphasize this approach. And I realize that the restoration system I presented is a very theoretical model, but every day I wake up, I really think about that this is the way we need to operate, because we're just, we can't afford to fail right now. And we really need to create the building blocks for success on many fronts. And that might mean not planting trees right away. That might mean, you know, convening multi-stakeholder platforms. That might mean doing modeling research to predict various outcomes with teams of researchers, and before we decide on what kind of restoration to do. And in the meantime, maybe just helping with some of the immediate needs that people have, and some nature-based solutions, and sort of as a stopgap measure until we can do a better job figuring it out. But I do think this holistic perspective is really important.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, Tina, would you like to ask yours?
Yes, thank you. So I started my PhD and I want to look at how we can use remote sensing essentially to promote monitoring of restoration projects. So I'm playing with this idea of having sort of a global framework and a global monitoring method, because you're saying we need these big global solutions. But then on the other hand, there's this big issue of site specificity, different biomes, different limiting factors, different promoting factors. So is it even possible to sort of combine this complexity, site specific factors with some general frameworks and methodologies that work reliably for, and also produce simple outputs for practitioners and people working in restoration? It's a question with many levels.
There is an effort underway. Many people have been discussing and trying to develop such a platform. There is a plan to develop what is being called a Global Restoration Observatory. And it would have as its basis remote sensing coverages with very high resolution that have a temporal record. So we can begin to look at before and after or during restoration, what is the evidence from the remote sensing data that there's more tree cover, or there's more riparian vegetation or whatever. With a high resolution, you can do that, basically look at local patterns at a global scale. But right now it's, how to set that up is a little bit complicated, and it requires just a lot of effort and expertise to get such a platform up there and have it be accessible easily to everybody. I do think there's a need to, this is where I would want the case studies to be located as little pinpoints on that map that you could click on, and you could, download the whole case study and find out all the background about what happened there, and what was involved and who did it and what they found. So that's my dream, of having the case studies be integrated with that kind of larger scale, more coarse scale measurement with the context, the human context and the social context visible, which you cannot see in remote sensing. So I do think on a local scale, there's a lot of potential for using drones, both sort of autonomous drones to do fairly rapid surveys of the area and to get a lot of fine scale information about what's happened before or after restoration efforts. We've discovered they're very useful for monitoring secondary forest recovery as well as for monitoring structural recovery of different kinds of restoration interventions within restoration projects. So I think this can provide additional very local project scale information, as well as on the ground monitoring that you can't get from remote sensing.
Can I follow that up very quickly? Who's the institution that's trying to set that up? Because I've been like searching with lots of keywords to like see whether something like that's already out there. Like didn't come across it.
Well, right now it's sort of being coordinated a bit through Climate Focus, and WRI is engaged very heavily. So the idea of the platform was that it would use some of the kinds of tools that are used for Global Forest Watch, but it would not be showing deforestation. It would be showing reforestation. But the problem there is that a lot of forest gain is not restoration. It would be, commercial plantations would also come out as forest gain in those kinds of analyses. So you need a lot of ground truthing and a lot of additional information to really look at what that forest gain really is. And that's where doing that at a global scale could just be prohibitive. So you need local experts who know, what's actually going on there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, Will Parker, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the role of including tree species which kind of meet functional traits in restoration efforts, and how you spoke, or some of the research you showed today demonstrated that natural restoration can often do better than kind of actual restoration efforts, and whether that is because natural restoration is kind of including some of these functional traits, for example, like nitrogen fixing trees in disturbed land. Yeah, thanks.
Good question. I think the reasons why are a little less clear from the meta-analysis, since we didn't collect those data ourselves. I know from my own research on natural regeneration that one of the real benefits is that you do get functional diversity, and you also get functional redundancy, which is very important for resilience and important for the fact that seed dispersal can be very limited. So even if there are species in the area, they don't always arrive at the site or right away. They might eventually. But it's particularly for the early stages of succession, you can get 15 different pioneer tree species in some cases, and they each have their own cohort of mutualists that they bring along, either seed dispersal agents or pollinators or other animals that use their stems for boring and things like that. So they do immediately begin to construct ecological networks in the site. And this can also enhance the arrival of new species and also prevent single species from dominating the site and create more diversity. They're also locally derived genotypes, so they are adapted to the climate and the conditions. And of course, now climate and conditions can change, but for rapidly coming in and colonizing and creating a forest ecosystem, that's the best material you could possibly use.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we just have a couple more questions now. So we'll close after these two questions. So Rupesh, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for this interesting talk. Very much enjoyed. So I just want to, you kind of touched upon this already a little bit, but I just want to ask you about the pitfalls of losing or eroding those social and financial capital when these things are not done right. So there's losing the trust there, which is very important for any of these success. But at the same time, we see a huge popularity of these big, like a trillion tree campaign and then UN decade for ecosystem restorations. So these are like mega global kind of campaigns which draw a lot of attention, and they have a political side to it because it's easy to take a picture when a tree is planted, but it's very difficult to nurture it and make sure it grows all the way to maturity. So when we talk about restoring and keeping all these factors, the the functional traits and all that in mind. Do you have any thoughts? How do we avoid those kind of pitfalls and kind of achieve what we aim to, given the constraints of finance, of social, lack of local capacity? So kind of a long question, but your thoughts will be appreciated.
No, it's a question I've thought about for many years. I think a real key is to really educate the donors, the people who are supplying the money for restoration, so that they understand what is involved. And actually, I had an opportunity. I was approached by Amazon.com. They wanted to do something big with restoration. They really loved this technology idea. They wanted to start a whole division, like, how can we make this happen? And after several back and forth discussions with, very lovely engineer at Amazon, I finally said, you got to understand, this isn't about tree planting. It's not, if you really want to restore, you have to engage the local people. You have to help build their capacity or learn from them. They may know more than you do. It's not about high tech. You can certainly use some high tech methods, but it really, it's not about buying up this huge amount of land so that you can restore it. And the guy was like, oh, okay. And after a few weeks, he wrote me back and he said, thanks, I really learned a lot from you, but we've decided we're not going to do this. So I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, but the fact is that you can reach people. There are ways, and some of the forums like 1t.org, they now have a corporate alliance. They are, I've been talking with them. There's a need to have a forum and to bring people together and have a seminar about this, have them understand that, this isn't just about offsetting your company's carbon footprint. And that's not going to solve this problem. So I think that a lot of the big donors are really the ones that need to be approached, and also, the other groups that will just do anything to get that money, regardless of what effect it's having in their country.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and a final question from Trisha. Oh, actually, you don't have a microphone. Okay, so I'll ask this question. This is a response to a comment that Terry made about restoring peatlands, and so Trisha asks, what are your thoughts on forest restoration, reforestation being in the limelight for funding and policy, etc., when compared to other pathways such as peatland restoration that has comparable potential? Does reforestation take all the glory or the attention away from other possible approaches to ecosystem restoration?
It should not. I think that some of our strongest advocates globally for restoration are coming from the forestry and forest ecology world, but by no means is this the solution everywhere. And I think that it's really important to elevate peatland restoration, wetland restoration in general, grassland restoration, coastal area mangrove restoration, and marine restoration. And that's part of what the decade is trying to do. And I think that the more people that get involved, the more that will happen. I think if people just sit back and say, oh, this is just all those bigwigs doing what they've always done, that's not what the UN decade wants to do. They have a definite strategy to engage all different stakeholders and all different kinds of ecosystems. So get involved, and that's the best you can do. Make noise and make sure that it doesn't become just about forests. It shouldn't be.
Okay. Yes, great. Thank you. Okay, there seems to be a final request from Vivek. Do you want to make a request?
My request is, I could see several papers published in science and nature journals, reputed journals, where different global maps are given predicting different trends for different biophysical variables. So when I try to use that map for understanding my study region is a remote mountainous district in Odisha, a state in India, which is a remote region. When I use that JPEG file in my Google Earth Pro tool, it's not good resolution. So what I request all publishers, even editors, could suggest people who are publishing such maps. They could give Google Earth Pro, because Google Earth Pro is free tool. They could give Google Earth Pro compatible map files. They could download it. I'm doing socio-ecological research as a researcher from ecological sciences background. I could make use of these maps to build my questionnaire, understand the situation and like that. So let's make things reproducible or usable much. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. No, I think the point that you've made is very important, that maps that are designed to show solutions at the global scale or to are not really useful. And I think a lot of that is because the basic layer, the basic spatial, the data that go into those maps is the limitation on that resolution. And you often have to subsample other data sets in order to get those all on the same scale to use in the models. So yeah, it is, we can't use global maps for the local scale.
At least with the given limitation, if it is Google Earth Pro compatible file format, we will be able to use it with informed decision making.
If the baseline data, if the baseline data are at that low resolution, then we could do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's a good time to end the discussions here. So thank you, Robin. You can see from the 40-50 minutes of discussions that we had that there's a lot of interest, and thank you for not only giving the content of your talk, but I think really tapping into your career-long expertise and understanding of insight into how what the opportunities are in restoration, but also what the challenges are in making it sustainable and done well. So it was really wonderful to hear from you and to have a range of other things happening. Okay,
thank you, and it was a pleasure. I really enjoyed presenting it and talking with you guys.
Great, thank you. And as I mentioned in the chat, we've recorded this and I'll post this onto our YouTube channel. So if you want, feel free to share it with your students and colleagues and others, and spread this excellent content widely. Okay, thanks very much, Robin.
Okay.
And good luck on Tuesday.
Everyone.
We're all there with you.
Yeah. Well, we won't have an answer on Tuesday. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.